Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you wore a dress that said, "Tax the rich," to a party where the ticket price is rumored to be more than some of your neighbors earn in a year. So here's the clean, uncomfortable question. Were you taxing yourself, or were you enjoying the benefits of the world you say needs dismantling? The question didn't sound like a slogan. It sounded like a receipt being slid across the table. This was primetime television, but it didn't feel like a studio segment with polite applause on cue. It felt like the kind of night where a community shows up because they've been holding the same thought in their chest for a long time. Not in a glossy DC set, but in the Bronx, her home turf, her supposed base, her claimed heartbeat. Folding chairs under fluorescent lights. The kind that hum and flicker like they're tired too. Working families who took time off jobs they can't afford to miss, and then tried not to look resentful about it. Parents who rearranged childcare like it was a military operation, because nobody's life is flexible down here. Older residents who walked blocks they didn't want to walk, because staying home would feel like surrender. They came because they'd seen the pictures. They came because the rent notices don't care about anyone's moral framework, and the grocery total doesn't accept ideology as payment. They came because bills stack faster than speeches, and "we're fighting" is a hard phrase to digest when you're eating noodles again. They came because their congresswoman goes viral a lot, and their lives don't. And they came because the gap between those two facts is starting to feel like the story. The stage was stripped down, almost insultingly simple. 2 chairs, 2 microphones, 2 versions of America staring at each other. Ted Cruz sat there with that practiced calm, the attorney posture, the "I'm not mad, I'm methodical" expression. He didn't introduce it as a debate. He framed it like a cross-examination without using the word. Across from him, Ocasio-Cortez looked camera-ready in a way that made sense for someone who lives in the modern political economy of clips and thumbnails. But under those lights, in front of those faces, the confidence didn't land the same way it does online. She tried the familiar smile, the one that plays well in a vertical video. It appeared, then hesitated, like it couldn't find traction in the room. Cruz started soft, which is how prosecutors start when they know the evidence is going to do the heavy lifting. He talked about branding without calling it branding, about performance without calling it performance. And then he let the central contrast hang there, not as an insult, but as a question with nowhere comfortable to hide. "You campaign like a socialist," he said, or something close to it, "and you talk like a tribune of the working class. You condemn the rich like they're a category of moral failure, instead of just a bracket on a tax table. You talk about sacrifice like it's proof of virtue, and you frame austerity as a kind of public holiness. So help us understand how you reconcile that with the photos people have been passing around like they're reading tea leaves. Help us understand why, when the cameras point at your life, it doesn't look like the life you preach." Behind them, the Met Gala photo filled the screen, and nobody needed it explained. There she was, walking those famous steps, draped in designer fabric, carrying a message in red letters meant to look like a challenge. In a vacuum, it's a clever piece of political theater, the kind that works as a headline even for people who don't like politics. In that room, it hit different, because that room lives on a different budget. The image wasn't just fashion, it was a mirror held up to a neighborhood that rarely gets invited into the mirror's frame. Cruz gave the photo 10 seconds, then 20, because silence is a tool when you want people to do the math themselves. He didn't say, "You're lying." He didn't say, "You're corrupt." He didn't throw any word that would make the conversation easy to dismiss. He just described the Met Gala as what it is in the public imagination. a ritual of wealth celebrating itself. Tickets priced like a down payment, champagne flowing like nobody's checking, celebrities competing to look as expensive as possible. Then he circled back to the phrase on the dress and asked the simplest question again. Slower this time. Were you taxing yourself, Congresswoman, or were you enjoying being rich? She leaned forward, activating that familiar earnest tone, the one that sounds like a friend explaining the news to you. She talked about political art, about bringing uncomfortable truths into elite spaces, about disrupting the status quo from the inside. And if you're watching from far away, that answer can feel satisfying because it's morally tidy. But in the Bronx, morality isn't tidy. It's priced per month. Cruz didn't argue philosophy. He switched to mood. He brought up the candid moments people remember even more than the staged ones. The smiling inside shot. The laughter that doesn't look like a protest. And he asked, without snarling, whether that looked like discomfort or enjoyment. It's a cruel trick, the way a single candid photo can puncture a whole narrative, even if the narrative has context. Because context requires patience, and patience is expensive when you're stressed. Then he turned to the audience and did something politicians do when they want to turn a policy disagreement into a personal wound. He asked them where they were that night. He described double shifts, broken subways, calculators on kitchen tables, that monthly ritual of choosing which bill gets paid and which gets delayed. He talked about parents telling kids they already ate, because pride is sometimes the last thing you can afford to keep. And he let the contrast do what contrasts do. Make people feel seen, and then make them feel used. The room didn't erupt. It tightened. That's different, and it matters, because tightening is quieter but more serious. A man in the back stood up and talked about his grandmother rationing medication, and he didn't say it like a talking point. He said it like someone who has watched a pill bottle become a countdown timer. He pointed at the stage and asked how tax the rich helps when the rich party keeps looking like a backdrop for her career. Security moved. Cruz waved them off, because letting the anger speak is part of the strategy. The man kept going, talking about kids sharing shoes, about parents doing everything right and still feeling like they're sliding backward. And the line that landed wasn't even ideological. It was personal. You play revolutionary online while we're drowning in real life. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, then closed it, because you can't stitch a viral explanation onto a room full of lived experience. Not without sounding like you're asking people to applaud their own hardship. Cruz asked whether she thought about them that night. He asked about the grandmother, the kids, the families choosing rent over food. And he asked it the way lawyers ask things they already know the answer to. She shifted, adjusted her blazer, touched her hair, the little movements people make when the ground underneath them feels less stable. The TikTok voice was gone, replaced by the plain human instinct to escape discomfort. And discomfort is where these moments live, because discomfort is the closest thing politics has to truth. That was round one, not because it proved anything illegal, but because it made the central tension visible. A message about the rich, delivered from a staircase built for the rich, under the eyes of the rich, with the ease of someone who belongs there. Maybe you call that strategy, maybe you call it symbolism, maybe you call it savvy. But the audience in that room wasn't grading strategy, they were grading sincerity. And sincerity is measured less by what you say than by whether your life feels aligned with it. Then Cruz shifted to money, because money is where abstractions become concrete. Congressional salaries are public, he noted, and he leaned into the math the way you would if you wanted people to feel the distance. He said she earns in 1 year what many of her constituents earn over several, and he let the room react to the implication, not the number. He asked about disclosures, about household income, about the lifestyle people infer when they see certain apartments and certain commutes. He framed it as a mismatch. If you're the voice of the working class, why does your life look like you've graduated out of the working class? He went further and brought up her partner's work, not as an accusation, but as a question about optics. If campaign payments exist, are they standard? Are they disclosed? Are they normal? And do they feel normal to the donors writing small checks? That's the kind of question that doesn't require proving wrongdoing to make people uncomfortable. Because discomfort doesn't need a conviction, it just needs a perception that the insiders keep finding ways to land softly. And landing softly is the one luxury working people rarely get. A teacher in the front row said she donated $50 and asked, in the tone of someone who isn't angry so much as embarrassed, what that money actually bought. Not legally, but morally, because moral accounting is the only accounting many voters still trust. Cruz didn't need to claim anyone stole anything. He just needed to ask whether the arrangement feels like service or like politics, as industry. Ocasio-Cortez tried to explain campaign finance like a syllabus, but people in folding chairs don't want a syllabus. They want to know whether they were part of a movement or part of somebody else's revenue stream. Then came the apartment question, the D.C. rent question, the how much does it cost to exist where you exist question. That's always a trap, because there's no good way to talk about expensive living without sounding like you're defending expensive living. Cruz compared rent to constituents' annual income, and the room did the thing rooms do when a metaphor becomes a measurement. Ocasio-Cortez didn't have to be villainous for the contrast to sting, she just had to be comfortable. Comfort can look like betrayal when the people watching are exhausted. He layered in the car, the photos, the lifestyle signals that social media amplifies. A Tesla becomes less a vehicle and more a symbol, fair or not, because symbolism is what politics trains people to see. A young worker talked about commuting, living with parents, not being able to afford any car at all, and hearing lectures about privilege. Again, it didn't prove crime. It proved distance. And distance is the enemy of representation, because you can't credibly speak for a struggle you no longer share. Round 3 was the jobs argument, the kind of argument that leaves scars because it attaches ideology to a missed opportunity. The Amazon HQ2 saga is complicated, and everyone with an internet connection has their own version of why it happened and who won. Cruz presented it as 25,000 jobs that could have changed a district, framed as hope that got turned into a trophy for activists. He pulled up posts and headlines and asked whether the celebration looked like victory for the community or victory for the brand. In the room, people didn't debate antitrust policy, they pictured their kids. A construction worker said he wanted the work, wanted his son to learn a trade, wanted the stability that comes with steady paychecks. He said those jobs went elsewhere and asked plainly, who got richer off the victory? Cruz didn't have to claim anyone wanted people poor. He just had to ask whether the politics of purity sometimes punishes the people it claims to protect. A mother said her son cried when the opportunity vanished, and she asked how anyone can celebrate that with a straight face. That question didn't need footnotes. It needed a conscience. Then Cruz moved into family, because family is where the audience's empathy is easiest to engage and hardest to defend against. He brought up the Puerto Rico grandmother photos, the damaged home images that spread widely and sparked donations and arguments and sympathy. He framed it as a moral test. If you can raise attention and money with a post, what responsibility do you carry for the real-world outcome? He asked whether repairs happened, whether help was accepted, whether the story became content rather than solution. And he kept it in the realm of questions, because questions are safer and sometimes sharper. An older woman said she donated on a fixed income and felt foolish now, not because she thought she was scammed, but because she feared she was used. That's the distinction that matters for credibility, because most voters won't swear a crime happened. They'll say something uglier. It felt like politics harvested their compassion and then moved on. Cruz asked why, if a public figure can afford to help privately, they choose to help publicly instead, with cameras and captions. He asked whether the tragedy became a prop, and that word, prop, hung there like a bad smell. Finally, he pivoted to climate, because climate is the ultimate arena of sacrifice language. He framed the Green New Deal as a moral demand on ordinary life, on vehicles, food, jobs, and costs. He asked whether the people making the loudest demands of everyone else live by the strictest version of those demands themselves. He brought up travel, convenience, and the gap between elite climate rhetoric and working-class logistical reality. He let plumbers and retirees talk about vans, commutes, and the way grand visions land like punishments when you don't have cushion. The point wasn't she committed a crime. The point was she lives in a different world. And the sharpest political critique in America right now isn't always corruption. It's insulation. Insulation from inflation. Insulation from consequences. Insulation from the policies that feel like polite inconveniences to the comfortable and catastrophic stressors to everyone else. Cruz portrayed her as a product of an ecosystem that rewards performance, and he asked whether she's exceptional or simply a modern template. That's the kind of question that spreads because it's portable, and it makes viewers feel like they're noticing something others pretend not to see. He ended by stacking the contrasts, not as verdicts, but as a pattern the audience could interpret. Met Gala symbolism versus neighborhood struggle, high salary versus low wages, activist purity versus lost jobs, viral empathy versus unresolved repairs, moral demands versus personal convenience. Each item could be debated on its own, but together they formed a story that felt plausible. And plausibility is the currency of political media. He called it socialism for you, comfort for me, without needing to say anything that would trigger a courtroom. And the room reacted like a room reacts when it suspects it has been sold a character and then shown the actor. Here's the part that makes it bigger than one person. And this is where the discomfort spreads. If representation is supposed to mean, I live close enough to your life to fight for it honestly, what happens when politics turns into influencer culture? What happens when messaging becomes the product, and policy becomes the packaging, and the audience becomes the fuel? What happens when leaders learn that outrage performs better than governance, and symbolism travels further than solutions? And what happens to a district when its struggles become someone else's content calendar? None of this proves a felony, and that's not the point, because the modern political wound isn't only criminality. It's the sense that the people with the megaphones are always doing fine, no matter what they demand from everybody else. It's the feeling that sacrifice is a speech for them and a bill for you. It's the suspicion that the movement is sometimes just a marketing wrapper around ambition. And it's the question voters keep asking, quietly at first, and then louder. Who is this really for? That's why moments like this, real or dramatized, resonate even with people who dislike the messenger. Because the underlying tension elite comfort wrapped in populist language, shows up everywhere in American politics. You can swap names and parties, and the skeleton of the argument still stands. The rules get preached downward. The people asked to do more are usually the people already doing the most with the least, and the people with the microphones rarely look like they're skipping meals. So the honest question for anyone watching is not, do you like AOC or do you like Cruz? It's whether you believe modern politics has become a theater where the loudest moral claims are also the most profitable. It's whether you believe public figures can live like celebrities and still credibly claim to be avatars of the working class. It's whether symbolism has replaced results because symbolism is easier to film. And it's whether voters are finally getting tired of being the audience instead of the client. If the Congresswoman truly meant the dress as disruption, why didn't the disruption look uncomfortable? If the job fights were truly about protecting communities, why do so many residents still describe them as lost chances? If the fundraising was truly about relief, why do people still argue over what relief actually materialized? If climate sacrifice is truly universal, why does it feel like the wealthy get the nicest version of sacrifice, the kind that comes with perks? And if any of these questions feel unfair, why do they keep appearing anyway? That last one is the real danger for any political brand. Not that critics exist, but that the critiques sound like something your own supporters might whisper on a bad day. Because whispers become doubts, and doubts become distance, and distance becomes turnout, and turnout becomes power. You don't need to prove someone is evil to break a brand. You just need to make the audience feel like the brand is selling them something. And once they feel that, every photo becomes evidence. Every post becomes suspect. Every explanation sounds rehearsed. In the end, the most damaging accusation in politics is not "you broke the law." It's "you're not who you say you are." That's a charge that lives in the gut, not in the statute book. And it's hard to defend against because it doesn't require a judge. It requires a public that still believes authenticity matters, and a district that still believes it deserves more than a symbol. And on a night like this, with fluorescent lights buzzing and folding chairs squeaking, that belief is exactly what's on trial. And once that kind of doubt takes hold, it spreads to everything else you thought you knew about a politician. Every polished clip starts to feel like a commercial. Every emotional story starts to feel like a script. Every slogan starts to feel like a product label. The audience stops asking, "Do I agree?" and starts asking, "What am I being sold?" That's a shift that doesn't show up in polls right away, but you can see it in people's faces when they listen. It's the look of someone doing mental subtraction, trying to figure out what's real after the hype fades. Because politics today isn't just about laws and budgets, it's about identity manufacturing at industrial scale. AOC didn't invent that system, but she fits it so well that critics don't even need to exaggerate. They just point at the overlap between her message and her media footprint and let viewers draw the conclusion. And if you're the one sitting at the kitchen table with bills, you don't draw conclusions gently. You draw them with frustration, because frustration is what happens when life has no room for contradiction. Cruz knew that, which is why he stayed away from the kind of claims that can be brushed off as partisan noise. He didn't need to say illegal. He didn't need to say corrupt. He didn't need to say anything that would force him into a technical debate. He aimed for something more corrosive, the idea that her moral certainty is a costume she changes depending on the camera. Costumes aren't crimes, but they are confidence killers, especially when your brand is authenticity. And authenticity is the only currency the anti-establishment wing can't survive without. If you're a conventional politician, Hypocrisy is almost expected. People shrug and move on. But if you built your whole career on being different, hypocrisy feels like a betrayal with interest added. The more you sell yourself as the honest outsider, the less forgiveness you get for looking like an insider. That's the trap of political celebrity. The pedestal is made of your own promises. You rise fast, but you also have farther to fall, and gravity doesn't negotiate. The Room in the Bronx, at least as it played on screen, felt less like a rally and more like a group therapy session with a camera crew. People weren't screaming ideology, they were describing their lives in plain, painful detail. And every time someone did, the gap between movement language and rent reality got wider. That's why the most memorable lines weren't Cruz's lines, they were the audience's lines. When a teacher says she skipped something to donate, that hits harder than any legal brief ever will. Ocasio-Cortez tried to steer it back toward the abstract, because abstraction is where she's strongest. Abstraction is safe. It's clean. It's a place where you can be noble without being specific. But a room full of people living inside specifics will always resist abstraction. They don't live in theories. They live in prices. And prices don't accept moral arguments. So every time she reached for ideology, she was yanked back by someone's monthly reality. At that point, you could see what this really was. Not a debate about socialism or capitalism, but a debate about trust. Trust is the thing voters give you before they can verify everything, because nobody has time to audit a public figure like an accountant. They trust that your instincts are aligned with their interests, even if they don't read every policy detail. And when that trust cracks, it doesn't break in half. It splinters into 1,000 suspicions. Then the audience stops looking for your best interpretation and starts hunting for your worst. That's where the Met Gala image becomes more than a photo. It becomes a shorthand. Not, she went to a party, but she belongs to a world that doesn't belong to us. And once that shorthand sticks, every nice restaurant post becomes suspect. Every travel post becomes evidence. Every stylish moment becomes a provocation. Is that fair, in a moral sense, to demand someone live like a monk, to represent working people? Or is it inevitable, because people who are struggling want representation that looks like solidarity, not aspiration? You can argue that a politician can advocate for working people while personally living well. You can argue that representation is about votes and policies, not about whether your shoes look expensive. But you can't argue people out of the feeling that you're preaching restraint while enjoying abundance. Feelings aren't facts, but in democratic politics, feelings steer facts like a hand on the wheel. And once the wheel turns, it's hard to straighten it with a press release. Cruz kept returning to the same theme in different costumes. Rules for you, exceptions for me. He didn't have to claim she's uniquely guilty of it. He implied she's just uniquely visible doing it. And visibility is brutal, because it strips away the comfortable lie that at least my politician is different. The new media age does that to everyone. It records what you post, it archives what you said, it repeats it back later. And it does it without mercy, because algorithms don't have sympathy. They have memory. Still, the most interesting part of the spectacle wasn't Cruz, and it wasn't AOC. It was what the audience represented, which was a kind of political mood shift. The mood wasn't ideological purity. It was exhaustion with symbolism. People are tired of being told that the right message is a substitute for a better life. They want improvements they can feel on their block, not an argument they can repost. And that's where the influencer-politician model starts to look fragile. Influencer culture trains you to perform empathy publicly, to turn values into content and content into attention. In that world, attention is the prize, and attention doesn't require results. It requires engagement. But governance is the opposite. It punishes performance and rewards boring competence, at least in theory. So when a politician carries influencer instincts into office, the mismatch eventually shows up like a seam ripping. Maybe AOC's defenders would say Cruz was cherry-picking, using optics to distract from substance. Maybe they'd say the Met Gala dress brought tax policy into a space that never hears about it. Maybe they'd say Amazon would have brought downsides that critics pretend don't exist, and that her opposition was principled. Maybe they'd say climate demands are urgent and discomfort is inevitable, and that convenience accusations are cheap shots. All of that can be argued, and in another setting it might even land. But the Bronx setting, the way it was framed, made one brutal point. People don't want to be the supporting cast in someone else's moral movie. They don't want to be the struggling backdrop that makes a politician look heroic. They want to be the point, not the props, and they can tell the difference when they're being used as scenery. That's why the grandmother discussion, fair or unfair, hit as hard as it did, because it touched a nerve about private care versus public posting. In regular life, if your family is hurting, you help first, and you narrate later, if you narrate at all. When someone flips that order, people start asking questions they didn't want to ask. Did the post come before the solution? Because the post was the solution for the brand. Did the attention matter more than the repair? Because attention can be converted into power, and repairs can't. Did the story become a tool? Because tools are what politics turns everything into when it gets hungry enough. And if that thought feels cynical, ask yourself why cynicism is rising everywhere, in every party, in every city. At this stage, Ocasio-Cortez's strategy was predictable. Broaden the lens, talk about systems, remind people who the real enemy is. It's a classic move, because systems are easier to criticize than the day-to-day choices that make you look contradictory. But Cruz kept snapping it back to the personal, not as gossip, but as accountability theater. He wanted voters to believe that the system isn't an excuse. It's a mask some people wear while they climb. And the more he repeated that, the more the audience seemed to recognize the rhythm of it from other parts of their lives. Because they've seen this before, just not in politics. They've seen bosses preach teamwork while taking bonuses. They've seen companies put up "We Care" posters while cutting hours. They've seen wealthy people scold them about consumption while flying off for weekend getaways. So when they see a politician doing a version of the same thing, it doesn't register as a shocking scandal. It registers as, of course. And that's the most dangerous reaction of all. Of course is how trust dies quietly. Not with a scream, but with a shrug. Not with a riot, but with a decision to stop believing the next time you're asked to. And once people stop believing, they don't necessarily switch sides. Sometimes they just stop showing up. They tune out, they disengage, they decide the whole thing is a performance, and they're done paying for tickets. Cruz, being Cruz, tried to frame that disengagement as a moral awakening. He implied that the influencer-politician era is a kind of scam of attention, even when no laws are broken. He implied that politics has become a marketplace where outrage is the commodity and voters are the raw material. He didn't say it in those exact words, but you could feel the implications sitting under everything. And the audience, already primed by frustration, didn't resist the framing. They leaned into it. Now here's where it gets tricky, and where the commentary gets sharper if you're being honest. Because if you zoom out, this isn't just an AOC story, It's an America story. We built a system where attention is power, and then we act surprised when politicians chase attention like it's oxygen. We built a culture that rewards performance in every industry, and then we ask politics to be pure. So the question isn't only, is she a hypocrite? It's, why does hypocrisy sell so well right now? Why do we keep elevating people who are great at moments instead of people who are great at outcomes? Why do we confuse a viral clip with a solved problem, like applause can patch a roof or lower a bill? Why do we treat messaging like a job description instead of a tool? And why do we keep falling for the same loop? Outrage, hero narrative, disappointment, repeat. If you're angry at her, you should also be curious about the machine that makes her possible. Because that machine doesn't belong to Democrats or Republicans, it belongs to the era. It's the incentive structure that turns every controversy into content and every content into a ladder. It's the reason politicians speak in captions now, in shareable phrases designed to travel farther than nuance. It's the reason voters feel like they're being managed, not represented, as if they're an audience segment. And it's the reason a town hall can feel like a reality show even when people's lives are on the line. That's why the 5 rounds format worked, whether you loved it or hated it. It turned politics into a familiar structure, like a series of episodes, each with a theme and a punchline. It made it easy for viewers to follow, easy to clip, easy to argue about at work the next day. In other words, it fought influencer politics with influencer tactics, which is either brilliant or depressing depending on your mood. And it raises an uncomfortable question. If the only way to beat the theater is with better theater, what does that say about us? At some point, the segment stopped being about her policy positions and became about a type. The type is the activist celebrity, the person who speaks in moral absolutes while living inside comfort. The type is the politician who talks like a revolutionary but navigates life like a brand manager. The type is someone whose enemies think they're dangerous and whose supporters think they're pure, while the rest of the country just wonders if any of it is real. And that type isn't confined to one wing, it just wears different costumes depending on the audience. So the real question viewers were left with wasn't, did Cruz win? It was, if politics has become this, what happens next? What happens when every representative becomes a content creator who needs constant controversy to stay relevant? What happens when governing becomes secondary to narrative maintenance because narrative maintenance pays the bills of attention? And what happens to people in folding chairs when their lives are reduced to proof points for someone else's ideology war? If you're looking for a neat ending, you don't get one because modern politics rarely delivers closure. What you get is a feeling, and the feeling after a night like that is that something has shifted. Not in law, not in official power, but in the emotional contract between a politician and the people who believed. A contract that says, I'll trust you with my hopes, and you'll treat them like something sacred. When that contract breaks, people don't always riot. Sometimes they just stop caring. And that's how democracies rot quietly.